Hello, everyone. My name is Gaëlle Morel, and I'm the Curator, Exhibitions and Public Engagement. That's my new title, so I'm going to use it tonight. I know. I do the same things, but welcome to tonight's event, Curator in Conversation, Privacy, Visibility, and Early Photography with Sarah Parsons and Zeynep Gürsel, held in conjunction with the exhibition Hypervisibility, Early Photography and Privacy in North America, on view until August 3rd in our university gallery, and we're going to stay late, open late tonight, so you can have a chance to see the exhibition if you haven't already. I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered tonight on the campus of Toronto Metropolitan University, which is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee peoples. We embrace our shared ongoing responsibility for this land. So I'd like to mention first a few program notes before we begin. So we are recording tonight's events, and we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel in the near future for those who weren't able to attend or for those who want to watch it again. So after the lecture, we will have a Q&A session led by Paul Roth, our director, and we will be taking questions from the audience. If you do have a question, please wait until we bring you a microphone before asking. This way we can make sure to capture you on the recording. So a few words about this project. This is all Sarah Parsons, who worked closely with Frances Dornbaum, her co-curator, who's here tonight. Thank you, Frances. And it's a research project that turned into an exhibition and soon a book, I think. Right? It will. Given the current ubiquity of cameras and the broad circulation of photographs in this digital age, photography can be understood as a threat to privacy. But even in its earliest forms, from daguerreotypes, cartes de visite, and stereographs to commercial advertising, the medium triggered both excitement and concerns about heightened visibility. So this exhibition considers some of those aspects as it traces the fascinating, interrelated, and overlooked histories of photography and privacy in the 19th century. So tonight, we're very honored and lucky to have Sarah Parsons with us. She's a professor of art history and visual culture at York University. Her research explores the history and theory of photography in relation to questions of ethics and power. And we're also very lucky to have Zeynep Gürsel with us, and she's a media anthropologist and associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her scholarship involves both the analysis and production of documentary images. So please join me in welcoming Sarah and Zeynep tonight. Thank you.
Oh, hello. So we're so happy that everyone's here tonight. When I was asked what kind of event I imagined doing in conjunction with this show, I will say that Frances will be giving a tour of the exhibition next week. That is another one of the events. But I was really interested in having a conversation about the project. I feel like it's a project that is about photography, but it's less about photographs than it is about photography as a social practice. So that really led me to thinking about Zeynep's work. And so I'm so happy you're here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm really happy you're here, and I'm very happy you're all here. So I think one of the things I really appreciate about this particular exhibition is that when you go to an exhibition, part of why you're going instead of reading a book is because you get to see originals. And of course, we're all very grateful to archives and curators because they show us originals. But one of the things that really excited me about this exhibition is as soon as you step foot in the exhibition, you're thinking about copies and the fact that photographs can be copied and are copies of things. And you're thinking about who has copies and where are copies circulating. So much of my work is as much about what does a photograph do and how does it circulate than what does it show. So I was really excited to walk in and immediately think, yes, there are some wonderful originals, but immediately I'm thinking about the promiscuous reproducibility of photography. So of course, immediately I wanted to know, Sarah, how did you come to this project?
So this project started, it actually came out of my research on William Notman, and really in a dialogue with the archivists and the curators at the McCord Museum in Montreal. And we were talking a lot about, if you don't know, that William Notman was sort of Canada's premier photographer. He ran a huge studio in Montreal and a network of conjoined studios across Canada and northeastern US. And what's really unusual is that he was incredibly successful for decades, and that archive is still whole. Many 19th century photography archives burned to the ground. It was a very unstable business. They would go bankrupt, but Notman Studio records and all the images are perfectly preserved so that we can see not only those images, but how they were archived and collected. And one of the interesting things is that when you would go to have your portrait taken, they would put copies of your portrait in a book. And that would facilitate ordering more copies. So then you would go back, you would choose the images you wanted, you would order them. And we realized that one of the archivists realized that in the notebooks, in these sittings books, occasionally there were notes that said, do not sell this to anyone but me, or do not sell this to anyone but my family. And there are not a ton of them, but we realized that those notes suggest that the default was that anybody could buy anybody's portrait. And since these were records from like the 1870s, 1880s, long before the handheld camera or halftone printing arrived, I realized that people were worried, or some people had some concerns about how photographs would circulate, and specifically their photographs would circulate. And that's really how the project kind of got started. And then I started seeing, as I was reading and visiting other archives, just all these little traces of anxiety about photography from certain quarters and around certain kinds of photographs.
Which immediately reminds me of Sherlock Holmes. And specifically, I am now going to digress for a moment. From Notman, if I say to Sherlock Holmes, she was the woman, is there anybody who knows who I'm talking about? It's Irene Adler. Yes, I see at least one person nodding, so I'm not the only fanatic in the crowd. Irene Adler is important not only for being the woman. This is the first Sherlock Holmes story, and it's called Scandal in Bohemia because the Kingdom of Bohemia is about to have a major scandal specifically because the King of Bohemia has had an affair and is now worried that the young woman he had the affair with will write to the noblewoman he's about to actually marry. So he seeks out the help of Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes, very fact-finding and practical, immediately says, well, was there a secret marriage? No. Is there any legal document that proves this? That there was an affair at all? No. Well, okay, but there were letters. Well, even if she were to send the letters, how could she ever prove their authenticity? And he says, oh, my handwriting. Oh, forgery. And then he says, well, my private papers. Oh, she stole them. That's no problem. My personal seal, stolen again, no problem. As you said, that she had bought this photograph. And then I imagine in the dramatic version, the King of Bohemia gets very quiet and confesses, we were both in the photograph. To which then Sherlock Holmes says, well, that was definitely an indiscretion, and now you are in trouble. And he says, I was young, and I wasn't yet King of Bohemia. So were there any photographs that were deemed, like any notes that said, do not sell to anybody?
Yeah, there was the one that really started our conversation was this archivist had just randomly come across a photograph early in her career there, that she could never find again because it had been deliberately removed from the whole archiving system. And it was particularly a photograph called A Gent for Mrs. Austen. And it was a photograph of a young man dressed as a woman. And it had writing on the outside of the glass plate that on the envelope saying this must not be ever put in the sittings book, it must never be sold to anybody. And and then she could never find it again. She just happened across it like 30 years later. And so that's how we were having this conversation about what level of trust that it turned out it was actually the mother who commissioned the photograph for her son, or of her son. And they were familiar clients of Notman's, and they clearly had developed a relationship with the studio and the staff, and they entrusted them with this very important task. And it's sort of a beautiful story, I think, of sort of how, before the handheld camera, to have your photograph taken, you had to entrust yourself to a commercial environment, or a high-powered amateur who had enough money and skills to do it all themselves. We were quite, those were your two options.
Right. I often think of it as like the notion of falling into photography, right? In the sense that even in this, it's a very touching mother-son story, like it's like falling in love because you want an authentic likeness of somebody. At the same time, photography is often dangerous. Mm-hmm. So once your photograph exists in the world, it can be bought in the examples that you're telling us about, but also, as this exhibition shows, other people can get their hands on your photograph who you never intended the photograph for, not least of which is the police, right? Which you have lots of interesting examples. But before we move on to the police uses of photography, I'm interested in some of the very interesting photographs are wearable objects. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because it really reminded me of how intimate photography is in this era, or at least that's how I had always imagined it.
Yeah, those photographs, the photographic jewelry, are so beautiful, and they're from Carol and Harold Tenenbaum's collection, and they are. It was a fairly common, or certainly every studio would offer, a well-heeled studio would offer this option for you to have a photograph set as a brooch, and we often think of lockets. But that sense of, it was very quick into the process of commercial photography, daguerreotypes, which are quite hard to see and we normally think of as very closed, private objects. The photographic jewelry kind of helps us to upturn that assumption that we see daguerreotypes in that sort of tiny closed state. But in fact, that's not the way they circulated in the 1840s. People were really excited to have their pictures taken, and they wanted to have them shown, and they would wear them. And that idea of keeping one's loved one close by, I think, is really, really moving. But there are also ways of moving in the world with somebody's portrait attached to you. So they really both connect bodies and visibility, and they sort of help you trace social networks in a public context. There are a couple of those, and I think there's one on the website, that are spinning. So you could choose to conceal the photograph, or you could choose to show it. And I think those are really interesting objects that kind of, so much of what the show is about is the way in which photography was both a tool that allowed you to make yourself visible with presumably some hope that you would be able to control that visibility. And yet it also presents this whole system. It functions within a system that makes it very hard to control that. And that's sort of where that tension around privacy comes from, And I think that Notman example kind of shows that. It was very clearly very important. There was a lot at risk that the Austins, put on the table when they went and had that photograph taken, but it was worth it for them to make that decision because they were very keen to have that
to have
photograph.
the photograph.
Yeah.
Right. So when, one of the things that surprised me about the show is, like the Sherlock Holmes example, so many things that I had thought, okay, come later. This show is actually reminding us start very, very early in the life of photography. The concerns start early, the anxieties start early, and to that point, you know, I did my first field work as an anthropologist with photojournalists, and the photo editors taught me very well, pay attention to size. Size matters. So the largest image in the show is actually the first one that we see walking in, and it's an enlarged lithograph that shows kind of it's called daguerreotype manie, so daguerreotype mania, the mania for daguerreotypes that emerged soon after it was invented, or they started being made. Tell us what you want us to see in that lithograph.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about this yesterday, and the fact it's a familiar image to many art historians because it's usually presented to talk about this terrifying moment when, you know, photography is going to overtake the arts, and, you know, there are parades of artists, you know, bemoaning the fact that they will no longer have jobs as, you know, printers, lithographers, that kind of thing. But what's so interesting from this context of that image is really all these anxieties or possibilities about photography that are previewed at this very early moment. In particular, the striking detail is the camera in the balloon above. So the way in which photography, even if it wasn't entirely able to do that yet, because of course it was very complicated and challenging to take photographs, especially if the camera was moving. That was really not possible for quite a long time after. But the idea that people already were imagining all these ways in which photography was going to be a potential tool of surveillance, how it was going to intervene in their lives. And there's also the commercial studio at the center where it says, you know, windows for rent. And it's a little unclear whether it's the studio space that has to be up, you know, in the attic with lots of windows, minus lights and electricity, or it could also be the windows on the street, because commercial studios very quickly start to, although they have to be located upstairs, they want window displays for their wares to try to draw people from the street up into their studio space. And there are these wonderful letters of the Southworth and Hawes, who were the premier Boston photographers. And one of them is away, and they're writing to each other. And Nancy Southworth says to her brother, oh, so-and-so came in today because she saw her portrait on the street. And thank goodness she did not ask us to take it down. Which, of course, again, these funny little traces tell us so many things. They were using people's photographs to advertise their wares, and they were definitely not asking their permission, even though she knew full well that Miss Greenwood might not be so pleased about that activity. But of course, there's always the possibility that, as it turned out, she was quite flattered by it and probably bought a few extra copies for herself because of it. So,
well, how else is a studio photographer supposed to advertise that they make a good portrait?
Yeah, and so those are the sort of details that I love, but they're within this much larger context of all these crazy details that people are already, in this very early moment, imagining, synthesizing, the changes it might make in entire ecosystem of visual culture, you know, the riffing on the idea that you had to be held so still to have your photograph taken, which in the print is a series of vice grips on the character who's sitting there that looks like a complete torture chamber, which of course was a familiar complaint about how terrible it was to have your portrait taken.
Yeah, I like how much, yesterday we were looking and realizing there's so much attention to how much things cost right? So the different size, if a full plate costs this much, a half plate costs this much, but also here you can rent a scaffold on which to hang a lithographer because this is the end of their livelihood. And so the idea of, you are now not just a sitter, you are not just a photographic subject, but you are a consumer, and you're doing that by paying for photographs. So what are some moments when studios were encouraging people to have their portrait made?
So there are a couple of interesting examples. For one, there's a studio in Boston that in the 1840s produces this little novella that's a love story, that's a super creepy love story about a woman who comes in to get her portrait taken. She's young, she's beautiful. When she is about to pay, she realizes she doesn't have any money. So the photographer says to her, "That's okay, I will take 2 images for you." She said, "I have to give one to my brother, he's going away." And he says, "Okay, well, I'll give you 2 images. I'll take 2 images. You take one for free, and you leave one with me. And I will use it on my wall as an example." And so she disappears. His friend arrives. His friend sees the portrait. He falls madly in love with her. And he buys it off his friend. And then he wanders through town looking, hunting for the woman, showing people the portrait until he finds her place of work. He tracks her down. And he goes, and she's ill and poor, but so beautiful. And he rescues her. And they come back for their wedding portrait. And this was a brochure for the studio.
Well,
so
it's obviously good for business.
Very good for business. The ending bit is that the photographer who's ostensibly writing this novella says that she won't lift her veil for the wedding picture. Not surprising after how she ended up in this stalker-captor situation. But this is there's such a demand that studios need to be constantly drumming up business, encouraging people to have their photographs taken and to circulate them, to gift them, but also, quite frankly, participating quite clearly in a culture of power, circulation, and giving people lots of ideas, sharing lots of ideas about what one might do with photographs. Mm-hmm. And there's quite in the longer version of this project, I look through all of these, and there are many of these kind of love stories, but also some written, like that one, in a celebratory vein, others that are written ostensibly by women, worrying about their portraits, wandering the world without them, and where they might go, and who might have them, and what they might be doing with them. And then others where, male writers are, writing about what women should be worried about. But it generally is a kind of gendered set of fears that are set up in that moment. Certainly something that feels very resonant to us. And then another moment where that happens and we see a kind of gesture to it, although we don't see it exactly, is during the Civil War. There was such pressure by studios to encourage everybody you can't possibly go to war without sending your picture with your loved one. And then there are these accounts of what soldiers did with photographs that they pulled off bodies or injured soldiers. Of course, we know that photographs are very meaningful and touching, and that if you want to hurt somebody, taking a portrait of someone they love and desecrating it is a very powerful tool of war.
And this was already an anxiety that was being written about in the Civil War. It was,
yeah. And then actual letters where people talk about, like soldiers bragging about what they did to the enemy's photographs.
Right. There's a exhibit on one of the walls that shows photographs that were pulled from letters that were undeliverable. I think that's part of the Civil War material that you're referencing. It's really remarkable. You know, you can see that these photographs have really nothing to do one with the other, except for the fact that these are all young men, or some of them not so young, who were off at war. But tell us more about how, because here we see it, of course, as a collection.
Right.
Right? How did that come about? That's not a collection that you put together. How was that put together?
Yeah, the American Post Office had an office called the Dead Letters Office, and it was a place where if mail was undeliverable, it would be delivered to this office in DC, and there were particular people who were allowed to open the mail. And it was a collection of retired clergy men on the main floor, and there was a balcony with young women of sort of good moral standing. And those were the two groups who were allowed to open your mail. And they would open it just to try to make sure that they could add more information and address it and try again. When mail was undeliverable, after that second try, it was eventually burned in piles. And photographs during the Civil War presented a really complicated addendum to that, because suddenly there were so many photographs moving through the mail, many which could not be delivered because obviously during a war, mail does not always find its way. And so the Dead Letters Society, the office didn't really know what to do with it, with all of these. And clearly they must have burned tons, because the calculations of their records show that there were like thousands and thousands. But what they did do is they pulled photographs of soldiers, which they made into these boards, and they used them as an exhibit in the Dead Letters Museum, which was up for a little while in DC. And then eventually, there were apparently more than 100 of these posters. The Eastman House owns 8, and they were very kind to lend us 2, because they're really unusual 19th century objects, because they were designed to be exhibited, to be shared, and they were pulled from the mail, which is normally an entirely private and sacred thing. I mean, they don't have names beside them, but certainly the idea was for people to come and look at these, and hopefully reclaim their loved ones. So there are a few examples, one in the Eastman House that has a notation where somebody did come and claim that photograph. Over time, they become these kind of memorials to the war, so they take on a whole nother set of meanings. But I think from a privacy point of view, it's remarkable not just to think about why things are pulled, but that we often are asked to set aside notions of privacy in moments of crisis and war. And we see that starting right in this early moment.
So these two are originals that then were made, that were probably photographed to be made into posters that would circulate. Is that correct?
No, those are actually the carte de visite and the tintypes, I think, that went through the mail. But then rather than putting them in the disposal bin, they created these posters instead.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because in this set, there's one it's tiny, and you can tell that it's a tiny object. I think it's a tintype. It's just the person's face, but it's almost as if it was inadequate to put that on the wall. It would have been somehow disrespectful, almost like the photographs had to themselves be like a military unit, and you wanted to treat everybody the same. And so it's placed on a mount that's the same size as all the other carte de visites. I read that as kind of, giving somebody a dignified public showing, or, you don't want to be tiny compared to all the other.
I would love to have found some record of how those were curated, but no. I did not, sadly.
I see.
Yeah.
And I mean, what you're saying is making me think about, like, what do photographs do? And why is what they do different than certainly letters, but other, kinds of images as well? I mean, like with many things, it's my students who really taught me that this matters, because, I always try to do this right before they're leaving for a holiday, whether it's spring break or Thanksgiving break. You know, they're usually by that point, they both really want to go home because they have a lot of laundry, but they're already complaining about their parents. And so then out of the blue, I say, okay, so how would you feel if, you know, next week you go home and you walk in, and when you go to throw something away in the kitchen trash, you find some of your baby photos. And it's like, oh no, my parent would never do that, right? And obviously I'm dating myself because I started teaching in an analog age. And it's been very interesting to see how, of course, you know, they're still horrified if their father calls them and says, I did something and I accidentally deleted all the photographs on my, you know, iPhone, and now I don't have any photographs of your childhood. But going back to intercepting photographs, of course, as you know, I'm very interested in how police use photographs. So that was why I was thinking about, okay, when are people eager to fall into photography? And you know, we've already talked about like when they're courting or wedding photographs, or the exhibition also has class of 1857, right? What college is it again?
Rochester.
University of Rochester.
Yeah.
That's right. So University of Rochester, class of 1857, sort of the class composite portrait. And I think of that as another moment where people are very happy to have their photograph, you know, showcasing an accomplishment. Let's talk about moments when you didn't, you know, your photograph fell into hands that you might not want them to be in. Mm-hmm. So tell us how you got into showing the police photographs that you have.
Yeah, so, I mean, when the New York police, and they were some of the first in the 1850s, started to experiment with mugshots, or, you know, rogues gallery, they called it. And that was true in England as well. And that was, you know, actually photographing regular criminals, so routine, recurrent folks. And the idea was that in New York, that you would the police would take these photographs, daguerreotypes, put them on a wall, and then so that you'd be able to recognize them, everyone who worked there would be able to recognize them, which clearly was happening anyway. And then if they had gone a certain period of time without a crime, then their daguerreotype would be turned over. And the whole thing made absolutely no sense. They eventually had to admit that. It was like they had ended up with way too many photographs. They had no way to archive them. They had no system. Basically, it was a very early case of a police force finding a new technology, deciding they were going to showcase that they could use it, having it make no real purpose, and then wasting a huge amount of money. But they eventually figured out other ways to use it. But one of the big complaints early on was that the subjects very quickly realized that if you move, their picture can't be taken. So there's already this way of subjects intervening in, like, I don't want to be captured this way, and I am going to prevent you from capturing me this way, which was, you know, that refusing to fall into photography.
Right.
But quite quickly, police forces realized that a much better way to do this, because there were so many commercial photographs, portraits of everyone existing somewhere, was to get copies of those and to use those instead. So the ones at the very beginning, as you go in on the right, those are from the OPP Museum, and they were in the later 19th century, people would fill out, or mostly, I thought it was mostly police forces, but you've discovered the one woman seemed to, you can tell that story. For the most part, it was the police would, if they were looking for somebody, would fill out all the information on the back, in the Bertillon kind of structure of, you know, all the descriptors and what they've done. And then there would be a portrait that was usually just from a studio, often contributed from the family maybe, or sourced from the photographer. And those would be glued together and they would be mailed to the police forces in major cities so that they could be on the lookout for those figures. So there's a way in which it very quickly turns from the police trying to use the technology themselves and that kind of failing to just turning to the commercial enterprise that was already there and is very happy to sell photographs to the police.
Right. Yes, that's a very good point, that the photographers were sometimes selling the photographs to the police. Just as in your example of Notman, where there's a catalog, that means the catalog can also serve the police force. But also there are plenty of examples of when the police, let's say, do a search in somebody's house and they find a photograph. Now that photograph can be used to look for this person as a suspect. There's actually the book version of the Rogues Gallery is by Thomas Burns, New York's first detective. And the book has, I forget now how many hundreds of professional criminals of America. And one of the things that's really interesting is exactly like you said, a couple of them move. And so not only do you have like name, where they're from, what their crime is, but you also have a description of the photograph. So this is a very good likeness of him. This is not a good likeness of him because he's sleeping, says one. Or this is not a good likeness of him because it's now many years since this photograph was taken, right? Or was moving, and therefore a good likeness could not be. So there's this from the beginning, this how good a likeness is. One of the photographs actually shows, it's like a standard headshot, but there's a hand on the man's right shoulder. And that was where I thought, oh, this is probably like two friends. They went to the studio. And then it's like, this photograph has now been repurposed as his photograph in case he's wanted, right? So one of the women you will, I think the only woman from the OPP museum, so I'll be very curious to hear if other people respond this way to photographs, but it's very hard for me to look closely at a photograph and know nothing about the person. I find myself compelled to ask questions, and I'm disturbed when I'm permitted to look at somebody and have no way of knowing anything about them. That somehow, I don't know, maybe it's a violation of privacy, to get back to our topic on privacy. But so when I was looking at the image of Rebecca Shanley, who you'll meet in the exhibition, she's a woman from New Jersey, and I currently reside in New Jersey, so I guess technically maybe I'm also a woman from New Jersey. Her crime is elopement. And she's described as remarkable, tall, blonde, a remarkable woman. And specifically the detail is that she has taken her young daughter with her. And so of course I was curious about this case. It's 1888. And it turns out that Mrs. Shanley did in fact run away from Jersey City, and her husband, Mr. Shanley, came to the police, and there's a New York Times article about this, and one of the things that really surprised me, so there's Mrs. Shanley right there, top in the middle. The New York Times gives the story as Mr. Shanley had several copies of a photograph he had at their home made, and spent all yesterday afternoon writing her description on the back of the photograph to be sent to major cities so that she may be found. Although the article does also add his only concern is the return of his young daughter, right? Which certainly, if he was hoping Mrs. Shanley would see this article, would not, maybe single-handedly convince her to turn back and come back to him. But I did find out that Harry Fuller and Mrs. Shanley ran off to Chicago, but they had an argument. And so in August of that year, so just about a month and a half after she ran away, Mr. Shanley then traveled to recuperate his wife and daughter. And at least according to census records, they remained married and residing together until death parted
until we
them.
featured as a major criminal of the 19th century.
So exactly. So that's one of the ethical questions that I have. Like when you see this lineup, right? And in fact, I would argue pretty much any time we see a group of photographs like that, we immediately tend to think these are criminal portraits or these are portraits of criminals. What are we to do? How do we interrupt that? Or, I'm just...
Yeah, I think that's a really great question and one that might be interesting to hear from others on. And the ethical questions are a bit complicated also by the fact that the OPP Museum is a museum collection that is, Chantal here? Yeah, she pointed it out when we were doing a discussion earlier. The OPP Museum consists of objects taken by individual police officers in the course of their duty and then gifted back. So it's not an official archive. The police records that are official and logged by normal means are in the Ontario archives. So this was also a collection that somebody pocketed and then gave back to the OPP Museum, which is just, and we're thinking about the promiscuity of these photographs. They're just wandering all over and into various hands, and they can be set up and contextualized in so many different ways. And I think it really just speaks to the bizarre range of possibilities that people were starting to clue into right at a very early point. And one of the things that we were really featuring here was also this sort of the constant display of photographs outside of contexts that we might normally think of. So the hypercirculation of photographs through the windows, through displays. Maya Sutnick, formerly curator of photographs at the AGO, and I were talking about the tramp display that is part of the AGO collection and came in under Maya's watch. And it's a little unclear what it is, but it's very much a like, look at me, look at me, look at these photographs. It's an extremely public display, which I was wondering if it was something from somebody's home, and Maya pointed out it could very well be from a studio as a sort of display case. A sampler. And we have other examples of samplers. This sort of constant circulation in that sense, where we think of, like things sitting quietly in a family album, but even that was not a sacred space. I mean, family albums were in your parlor. They were looked at as a sort of activity. That's the space where you brought guests in, and you would put them on your table, and you would look at them together. And then the example of the wanted poster is another place where police action kind of comes into and intersects with the family album. The Lincoln conspirators, those photographs, I mean, Wilkes Booth was a famous actor, and so many people had his photograph. But the others were sourced from their mothers. Right after Lincoln was killed, they understood at least who some of the suspects were, and the Secretary of War sent people to the mothers' houses to go through the albums and get examples, and then they took them to Gardner's studio and had them copied and then pasted onto these wanted posters. So that idea that the family album is also a sacred space is already disrupted in so many different stories. So it's
I mean, I think that's an extraordinary story about the wanted poster. It's reminding us a point that some in this very audience have made, that we tend to think of a family photograph in a very particular, narrow way. right? And in fact, is it about what's shown in the image, or is it about who paid for the image, or is it about who has the image, or who's circulating the image, or who has the authority to look at it? I'm struck by the fact that the wanted poster is one of the things that we as an audience in this exhibition are actually not seeing an original of. We're seeing a reproduction. And I thought, you were explaining that that has something to do with specifically why wanted posters with photographs are very, very fragile.
Yeah.
Tell the audience about that. And I wanted to know, were there wanted posters with photographs before this event? Or was it the first crime that was so notorious that...
As far as I know, and I'm sure there are people who can find other examples, it was pretty rare. I would say there is an example in Matthew Fox Amato's amazing book on visual culture and slavery, where he shows an example of a runaway, a poster, something filed with the police in the South by a slave owner of an enslaved person who had escaped. And again, it's a cut photo. So she was taking care of a child, and often they would take enslaved members of the family, as they called the situation, to the studio and have them, photographed with the child, like the hidden mother photograph that we have here. It was very hard to photograph babies, so there's two ways of thinking about these caregiver and child photographs. One is to create this, as T and Elspeth and others on our family photo project have thought about in terms of does this create a bizarre sense of family, or is it a mechanical way of holding the baby still? But for that particular wanted piece, the child is trimmed out and it's just the face posted with the police. And that would have been put up in a window. But that was pretty rare. And of course, it's very difficult for these objects to survive because this is before halftone printing. So there's no way to integrate text and image in one object. So it always has to be stuck on. And carte de visite photographs are a heavy object. I mean, not hugely heavy like daguerreotypes, but they're heavier, much heavier than the newsprint that text was printed on. And so they tend to, the physics don't work, and there are very few of the Lincoln poster left. The one we have here is reproduced. I think there's one at the Met, and there's one at Library of Congress collection. But other than that, there are very few. And then the other wanted posters, there are really very few others. I mean, Lincoln paraphernalia is collected obsessively, so there's always some of that. But the other ones are a scrapbook that someone made, and no one knows why, but it ended up in a library in Nova Scotia. And it's a combination of a few Canadian examples, but mostly American.
Of wanted posters.
Of wanted posters that include photographs.
This person was looking for a job and thinking this could be lucrative. Yeah. Wow. How are we doing on time? Yeah? I'm seeing lots of eager, smiling faces, and I'm wondering if we should
Sounds good.
ask. Or maybe I should end by saying, since I'm so glad that there is a book coming out, because clearly you have lots more that you've researched that I know will interest all of us. We're looking forward to the book. Is there anything that you want to tease us with? Anything that I've failed to ask, but that we should not fail to tell the audience about?
I mean, I think that what really interests me about thinking through this early moment in relationship to our current moment is this reliance on commercial enterprises to circulate our images. The period in between, by the time we often, when we think about photography and privacy as an issue or a problem, we think about the 1890s, the handheld camera, and there are wonderful examples that we gathered here from the Ryerson collection and Eastman House of this obsession to conceal cameras as soon as they could be produced as an amateur activity, which is, pretty weird. But But then cameras and photography really move into everyone's hands to a certain extent. And although developing takes longer, but there's a period, where it functions in a different way. Whereas the early moment and our moment, we rely generally on social media companies to be and internet giants to be the ones who allow us to maintain, and circulate our images. And of course, always having a commercial enterprise that you are engaging with, whose desire is always to make our images as promiscuous as possible, to sell things, to sell us things, to compromise us in ways, and to entice us with that idea of being visible in the world, to matter, and that with it that comes all that risk. We often talk about the concerns about privacy today, but I often hear, sometimes from my students, sometimes from other generations, well, it can't be that big a deal because we just keep using it. And I guess one of the things that really interested me about thinking about this moment is that we don't think it was an issue, but if you if you ask different questions and pay attention, it was an issue. It was that the balance of the desire for visibility outweighed, in many cases, and for most people, the concerns about privacy. And so I don't think that means privacy wasn't an issue. I think it means it's a really important question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Zeynep. That was wonderful. My name is Paul Roth. I'm the director here at the Image Center. It's such a pleasure to stand up and see how many people are here, I have to tell you. So thank you all for coming. Just before we start taking questions, I do want to say that on behalf of all of us at the Image Center who worked on this exhibition, we really want to give our profound thanks to Sarah and to Francis. It's many years ago now that Sarah first approached us earlier in her research and proposed this exhibition. We at the Image Center are really interested in the medium and how the medium operates. And we were very excited by her idea then. And for us, it's a pure pleasure after all of the time that's passed, after all of the trials and ordeals that our society has gone through in the last few years, to see the exhibition realized. And we're very proud to have partnered with you and Francis to host this show. So thank you very much.
Thank you. The team here is so amazing. I can't say enough good things. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Anyhow, I see already a question, so we'll jump right to audience questions. Please remember that somebody's going to bring a microphone to you, and then you can ask your question once you have it. That's so that we can capture your question for the recording.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. It was really interesting, the talk and the exhibition. I had two related questions. One is, how representative are these photos of the period? And to return to the question at the beginning, what are these photos doing? The link is that it clearly, obviously, you curated the exhibit, but I wanted to know if those were natural categories. In other words, were they grouped? Like, there was this sort of a lot of photos of indigenous people. There were a lot of photos of criminal types. There were a lot of these bourgeois families. Were there working class families that maybe didn't make it as much into the exhibit? There were the Civil War photos, so maybe those were working class people, but they weren't family photos, right? Mm-hmm. So that was about the representativeness, and then what the photos are doing. With some of the photos, it made me think about early eugenics and Lombroso and criminal types and stuff like that. But then other parts of the exhibit were obviously serving other kinds of functions. And you didn't talk too much in this exchange about this, so many photos of indigenous people, and maybe you could just say that. So then maybe the representativeness and what some of these photos are doing because they're serving different kinds of functions.
Yeah. So that the section that has some indigenous subjects and some photographs, Pateau photographs from France, that sort of section was thinking about the way as photography really kind of becomes an increasingly important medium in many different areas of social context, that it captures more and more people, get captured in the gaze. Whether it's the stereographs of the Modoc War by Muybridge, those are basically, they were sets of news photographs. So because you couldn't, there were no photographs in newspapers, you would read your text news, but then you might go into a photography studio or even a bookshop would sell, and you buy a catalog and you could order it by the mail. You would buy these collections and then you would look at them together with friends or family in your parlor, and you would have a conversation about that event or activity. And so those, people get captured in the news. And I mean, but because that system is sort of running, and everyone starts to get, if you're a part of a news story, you're going to get captured in photographs. So the question posed there is not necessarily whether this was, whether anyone's refusing that. It's that it's really hard to imagine as you're standing in front of a camera where that photograph will go, right? Just how broadly they start to circulate quite quickly. Certainly ethnographic tools it was an important piece, and that's more Zeynep's area of expertise, but those plateau photographs are really interesting. In part, they're also from the AGO collection, because the subjects are photographed as sort of ethnographic subjects, but so that is to say through the tradition of like a frontal portrait and a side portrait to capture, the complexity, but they're dignitaries visiting France. So it's not taken in the field. It's like somebody who's come for a very specific kind of high-level purpose and then gets subjected to this kind of particular use of the camera. To your earlier question about how representative the images are, I mean, the vast majority of very early photographs are portraits. It was the biggest moneymaker, the reason people would engage with photography. So in that sense, the emphasis here there are quite a lot of photographs of people. But I would say in terms of technologies and techniques, this is pretty representative. It's pretty broad. Like there are very few 19th century technologies that are not represented in the show, but that wasn't part of the intention of the show, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to also support Sarah's answer in terms of the representation when we're thinking about that ethnographic section, well, I think actually the section at the back has one image by, I believe, Seth Park, who's Canadian studio portrait, and it is of an indigenous figure that I guess hasn't been fully identified, but he comes in his own outfit and is presenting himself like with his own kind of autonomy and control. So even if that one is a rarity, I think we wanted to show that kind of example that was possible and to honor someone in a dignified fashion. And then I also think that the Modoc Peoples by Muybridge are an interesting specific example because those people were standing up for their own territory. And so even though Muybridge was working for a government, this was also another moment where perhaps I don't know for sure, but I imagine it was an unusual circumstance in which they were proudly standing their ground against another power. So that's kind of unusual, I would say, and then in how we're showing different ethnographic purposes and issues of consent.
Thank you. Any other questions? Right over here.
Hi, thanks so much. I really liked what you said about the show an id paid for and looking at an image. I really liked that. Mostly because I've looked at a lot of Hannah Maynard's work and just how she created photographs both as artistic works as well as works for consumption, both within the criminal justice system. as well as portraiture. And my question is about the creation of narrative, because having been to her studio, which is now a very fun restaurant in Victoria, there's still boxes and boxes of props that people would bring into their photograph. And they would all of a sudden, you know, a very average person would all of a sudden look very not average. And so it's like, how much of creation of narrative did you look at in this exhibition?
Great question. I can't say that we thought too much about it in this context, but I have written about it in other contexts, specifically in Notman's studio as a space of performance, of identity performance. It was really the way that a lot of people thought about going to a studio, and the higher level studio and the more creative the photographer, the more encouraged, you know, clients were to use this as a space where they would really explore. And Hannah Maynard's like wacky, I mean, just so good. And I mean, we couldn't get them, and we didn't even, you know, she took amazing mugshots, right? I mean, she has one of a woman who looks like Cynthia Nixon from Sex and the City, and she's wearing the most fantastic hat. And there is no way you're supposed to wear a hat. Like, they would literally, the cops would bring the people to her studio to be photographed, and then by the time you're done, it's like they were probably like, can I please have a copy of my mugshot? But she, you know, this way in which photographers were doing this work and sort of back and forth is really a fantastic kind of question. But in that sense of, in the way in which that intersects with privacy, I think is very interesting. The obvious example would be the Gent for Mrs. Austen, which is itself the most private performance, that it was very important that it be photographed. But I think that there are many other examples like that of people who perhaps were trying out different, you know, versions of themselves. And I mean, you see it because of the Notman studio, the way it's set up, you can track the same sitters who go every year. And there's some of one of the Molson daughters who also put restrictions on their sale. But like, they completely reinvent themselves year to year, like depending, I guess, where they, you know, who they're hoping to send these photographs to. And
Well, I'm thinking like what you're saying, the year after year sitter, but I'm also thinking about it in the idea of Instagram filters.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you're very thin and very blonde. And then the next photograph, you are very short-haired and not so thin.
Right.
Which it's an interesting creation of narrative.
And I think it really goes back to the same question of desire for control, right? Of the way you, Laura Wexler has this wonderful quote that's basically, the issue is, you know, being represented in the way you want to be seen, right? Something very similar, I think, in Ken's show on the wall. But that idea of your photograph, you want it to encapsulate the way you imagine yourself or the way you want to be in the world. And when we talk about privacy, it's not a black or white, it's a negotiation, I think, of that feeling, and that's where we get to ethics and, you know, consent. So thank you.
And I think it's also important to note that this show represents the earliest stage, but of course, things evolved. And at a certain point, police photography in particular gets less conflicted and more systemic. Right. And privacy is just completely ripped away. And of course, the idea of contracting with an outside photographer to take mugshots probably became much less common as time goes on, and police forces start to employ their own photographers in order to systematize and produce images that serve their purposes better, let's say.
But I mean, I think these questions of, I mean, money always matters, right? Especially when we're talking about police budgets and new technology. So I was just looking at a series of photographs from the 1930s and 40s Chicago police force, and the question of how many people can you fit into one shot. So Like if 2 people have been arrested together, can you photograph them together? Yes, but if 5 have been arrested together, well then that gets, that gets blurry and sort of, so I think thinking through anything that encourages us to always be asking the question, who is paying for this? What purpose is it serving? What unintended consequence is it going to have? I think questions that, and that's why I'm so grateful for this exhibition, is it's always, these are sort of critical questions to take with us always. And going back to the first question that was asked, I don't know if, the gentleman's still here. I think it's really important when I see something, I now have a responsibility to these images. So the ethics questions aren't only about asking what was happening between the photographer at the time and what I'm looking at in the case or on the wall, but what is now, what 2 photographs have been put together, but also what questions is this making me ask here? And what am I going to do with those questions when I walk out of here? And how do I take that to another photograph that I see, right? So that, I think I like the idea of falling into photography because I think we're all, once you see photographs, you're implicated. So I think that makes these questions, more complicated, and there aren't sort of the checkbox of, now this has been consented, because it's like, well, when was consent given? What were the conditions under which consent was given? How might that change over time, right? And Mrs. Shanley was okay with her photograph being taken in the first years of her marriage, but was she really thinking ahead to when she wanted to elope with another man? Was she okay with that photograph being used to search for her, right? I mean,
And the one of the sets we didn't talk about were the photographs of like Rosa, the young enslaved girl who's praying, and there are several others from that series. And those children were basically removed from the South. They were enslaved children who basically present and photograph, more importantly, mostly as white. And they were used as subjects for a campaign that was raising money for abolition causes and for schools in the South. But those photographs were sold so widely. And the children were taken on tours and presented at lectures, all for a really important political cause. But to go back to your point about narrative, they're conscripted into a narrative that shaped the rest of their lives, because they are, their name, not their full name, but their names, their characters, and they're posed in particular ways, and they're children, right? They can't give consent. They need to be children for that narrative to work, because they need to be pure and untouched, and But again, thinking about what consent means, and and also how those moments change over time through these photographs circulating constantly and in dialogue with other kinds of narratives.
Those questions persist even when the photographs are hanging in a museum.
yeah,
So,
absolutely.
they're no less relevant. All right, I think we have time for 2 more questions. All the way back there.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wonder if you could speak to notions of usage, dollars, and power in relationship to the photos in the exhibit.
2 minutes, yeah. So I feel like we've touched on some of that in terms of thinking about. Do you mean in the original moments in which these were made, or do you mean now?
I mean now, for example, are there photos that had notes that this should not be sold in the exhibit? Are there, and is there a difference between used and sold?
I think there's a difference between used and sold, but it wasn't very common in the 19th century. I mean, you would, for instance, when carte de visite, you would buy in sets of like 20, right? And then, so you'd buy them and then you'd give them to people. The idea of someone going and tracking down your portrait and buying it was certainly possible. I don't think it was happening as frequently as gifting your photograph and sharing it with others. In which case, then there's a purchase and then a use that is slightly distinct, right? I mean, I think those are the distribution channels that we've often thought about because they feel like they're full of consent, right? And they're removed from the commercial. But certainly there were lots of other ways that, you know, and since money is power, there are ways to commission other people's photographs. We see examples of that in the show. Is there more to, what did you add to that?
Sure. I mean, I think, yeah, the last example you gave of Rosa, the former enslaved girl who has her hands in a prayer in the photograph that is being sold to presumably raise funds for her and for other children sharing her plight. I think that's where what money buys you is the self-righteous sense of you have done good in the world because she is praying for herself and praying for your good deeds. And I feel like that's certainly something, I mean, you know, you don't have to go back to the 1980s Save the Children campaigns. Like any news story, I mean, many news stories today is full of, you know, similar photographs that are also asking about whose money is in effect producing this photograph or the condition that the child is in this particular photograph, right? So I think that's an excellent example of a rubric that then you can, you know, carry both back in history and towards the future.
Thank you. And we have one last question right up front here.
Hello. My question is, were rich and influential people able to go to these studios and not just give a directive about don't sell my photo, but actually buy the negative and remove it themselves and take it home?
People definitely did that. It was less celebrities seem pretty, generally, quite excited to have their portraits taken and sold widely. And certainly that's the kind of funny piece. I think we all understood that that commercial studios made a lot of money off selling celebrity portraits. I think what maybe we missed was that the division between public and private people, between celebrities and your everyday, was actually much messier than I think we understood. We understand the actors, the Sarah Bernhardt is a famous 19th century actress. Those people sit in one place. But in fact, some of the restrictions in the Notman records are around clergy, which we were pretty excited when we saw because we thought, well, these are going to be great photographs. They're not. They're super boring. But the reason was because the diocese sold the photographs because you couldn't have a family album in Quebec without having your family and your local priest. And so everybody needed to have a copy, but the diocese wanted to sell it and make the money, not have Notman sell it and make the money. So, you know, and then later, a little later in the century, photographers started to just pay celebrities, like to sit for them, under the condition that they would then be able to sell these photographs and make the money back and hopefully more.
I didn't quite mean celebrities, but just influential and rich people.
Absolutely, but anyone could. Anyone could just say, you know, I want the negative. There are some examples of that in Notman's records. There are also just, you could break the negative. They often Notman's studio would scratch the negative. Sometimes it would just be cracked and you'd throw it away. But you could buy it.
Are the Notman photos available online to see them all?
So yes, some of them are. There are a lot available, but there are about 400,000 photographs in the Notman archive. Many of them are on glass plate negatives, which is a very, it takes up a lot of room and it's a real handful to manage. So, but I think they're up to like 40,000 that are available online.
That's plenty for me.
Yeah. And they're amazing quality, and you can download them.
Great.
Yeah.
Because I have a short anecdote about George Eastman. In the 1920s, they were arguing, had a big business meeting where a new film was coming in. They were arguing about it, and Eastman just sat quietly in a corner, saying nothing. And then he finally spoke to say, "Gentlemen, we're not in the film business. We're in the memory business." And that sums up a
Indeed.
lot of photography, and
Yeah.
human emotion seems to have not changed in the 150 years
Right.
we're talking about.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was wonderful for both of you.
Thank you.
I want to second that. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for coming. Just a reminder, we are going to stay open until 8 o'clock, I believe, and then and the gallery will be open. So if you haven't seen the show, if you would like to see it again, please feel free to go. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's fun.